it's Composting 101. And I see people are adding to the chat. Thank you. Where you're from and what's one thing you wish would be compostable. My name is Kelly Kunkel, and I'm an extension educator in health and nutrition with the University of Minnesota Extension. And so we are really pleased to have Shane Bajea here today to talk about Composting 101. I'd also like to say a huge thanks to Rick Meyer, and he is our webinar producer today, and he has started the recording, and we'll be looking for questions in the chat. So as you have questions, be sure to put them in the chat, and we'll answer those at the end of the session. It's my great pleasure to introduce Shane Bajea, and he's been a local University of Minnesota Extension educator for Blue Earth and Le Sueur counties since 2017. He holds a bachelor's and a master's degree from Iowa State University in agronomy and soil science, respectively. And he specializes in soil health and invasive species and insects. And he enjoys reading, observing nature, and writing. So please join me in a virtual round of applause for Shane Bajea.
Thank you, Kelly. So yes, welcome to Food Composting 101. And I hope it's not too much like a 301 or a 2, anything above that, but I'm looking forward to talking about composting with you all today. So this is just kind of an outline of what we're going to be discussing. At first, we're just going to talk about what is composting, what do we mean by that, why should we compost, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty about how to compost, and then if there's any troubleshooting issues. So before we began today, Kelly and I were talking about maybe some issues that she had in her area, and we might be able to hopefully give some solutions to some of those problems. So when I talk about composting, I'm really talking about controlling decomposition. So we have some plant material and we want to have it decompose into a useful product. And composting is kind of a method that we as humans can kind of tilt some things in our favor and make it work for us. So that kind of definition, that controlled decomposition definition, was from the US Composting Council. I really like that because that's essentially what it is. And we use compost for quite a lot of things. And one of the things that we mainly use it for in kind of a selfish sense is to improve the soil for a lot of our garden plants, our vegetables, our flowers, and fruit trees. Kind of one of the good things also about composting is that it's a good way to reduce some food waste that would otherwise go into a landfill or not be used productively. And we won't get too much into this, but while composting does have nutrients and as part of its structure, it really oftentimes plants need quite a lot more than what compost can provide. So always bear that in mind. You might have to apply some other fertilizers from other resources. And of course, I'm from University of Minnesota Extension, and I recommend a soil test. Anytime where you can improve the fertility of your soil. I'm a soil scientist guy. Compost is good, but sometimes if we need more fertilizer, we might have to look for another resource. So composting is not a new phenomenon. Humans have been doing this for thousands or years. And this handsome gentleman on the right was Cato the Elder, and he was a Roman politician and general. In one of his books that he had written, he talked a lot about making compost with straw lupines, which is in the Mediterranean area. It's a type of a legume, chaff, which is just kind of husks and from wheat, bean stalks, holly leaves and oak leaves, and he kind of recommended making a compost out of all of that and putting it on your farm. And the odd thing about ancient Latin, is that the word for compost and the word for manure, stercus, it's pretty much the same thing. So you can kind of see that they kind of knew that it was a positive input to their farms. And kind of going back, so this is interesting. I've been reading this book even before I was asked to give this talk about composting, and I found it really fit well. So in there's a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries, and it was written by Francis Hiram King, who was a University of Wisconsin professor in the 1900s. And what he was a soil scientist as well, and he was kind of disappointed about how quickly we tended to exhaust our soils and have our soils be really degraded based on on the practices of agriculture back then. And he wanted to see how things were done in Southeast Asia, and what he realized is how they managed their waste from animals and people, and they use that in a productive way to help the fertility of their crops. So this is this is just kind of right before large scale industrial agriculture, when we had to rely a lot on fertilizers. So people were still using a lot of manure and compost back then, and that was especially true in Southeast Asia. And one of the things that he really noted about was compost pits that were dug by the farmers in these areas. And a lot of times it was kind of a mixture of mud, crop residue, some manure from their animals, and they kind of just dug a pit, put that stuff in there and capped it off with some soil. And then later on, the following growing seasons, they would just kind of shovel that back onto their farms. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It's a type of, what they were performing was a kind of passive or cold composting method, and it's a little bit different than what a lot of people do in their backyards. But it wasn't only limited to rice fields and wheat fields out there. It was also important for silk production. So if you don't know, silk is made by silkworms. And those animals were fed by mulberries and mulberry trees. And a lot of times they would make compost even using some of the waste product, the waste mulberry wood and the leaves, as well as the silkworms' manure, so to speak. So really ingenious methods of composting that was done. I recommend people, and that's the latest edition, I think, that you can find at a bookstore, but some of the wording is kind of antiquated, but I think he was very impressed by how they were managed to keep their agriculture going for a long time, keep their soils healthy, and recycle things, and how important composting was. So here's some photos that he took when he was on his tour, and you can kind of see now. It's again, this is 1911, right? So we're not expecting color photos necessarily. But you can see some of these piles. So the material, the field in the back here, and I don't know if I can get my laser pointer here. Ooh. Yep. So you'll see this is in the back here is, I believe he said it was a clover field. And then over here is some animal manure, and you can see this pit has been dug. So they were about to cap it off and use that as one of those manure compost pits. And then this is after a rainstorm. You can see where they had dug these pits before, and they kind of had some water on it. But again, this was what he observed, and those are his photos. So now we know a little bit about kind of maybe the history and why people might compost is we're going to get to the why, I should say. So why should we bother doing this in our backyards and our farms? So one of the things that I like to take away from it, again, my background is in agriculture. So I'm thinking about, how can we get one more productive cycle out of using all of these fertilizers that we use nowadays and large scale agriculture and horticulture. Plants aren't very picky about where their nutrient comes from a lot of times. So if it comes from compost or manure, and again, we're not adding a ton of fertilizer, but we are using some of it, and it's available for a longer period of time than something that we might pick up at the garden store. So what compost can help do is just save a little tiny amount of that fertilizer and make sure it's used productively again. A lot of the fertilizers that we use in large scale agriculture and horticulture use a lot of carbon. That's very carbon intensive. A good example of that is something called the Haber-Bosch process, which is what quite a bit, about 3 to 5% of all natural gas is used to make fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. So that's quite a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions from this one process that we use. So again, when we look at food waste, I think of fertilizer waste, and then we think of carbon emissions too, and climate change issues. So it's something that you can do, you can take some action on and get some agency to the process, right? We want to feel like we're doing at least our part, and compost can just take that tiny bit of fertilizer off the board that otherwise would be lost in a landfill. And this is kind of going towards the food waste option, the problem that we deal with lots of food waste. So this is from the Environmental Protection Agency. They kind of have this food recovery hierarchy, and they talk about, well, the best thing that we can do is just reduce the amount of surplus food. Then if we do have that extra food, we can feed hungry people. And if we can't feed people, maybe we can feed animals. And if we can't feed animals, then maybe we can use some industrial uses for that. And then composting is something that we can do that comes into play right before it gets to the landfill. So some of the other benefits of composting, and we mentioned it builds your soil up. And what do I mean by that? Well, I like to talk in our line of work, or in my work, we talk a lot about organic matter. And organic matter is very, very important to soils and to healthy growth of plants. What it really does is it's a really good nutrient bank. It holds nutrients very well. It has lots of different ways. Chemical bonds are different. So a lot of things that ordinarily would be lost or leached away will be able to be held tightly to your garden bed and be released slowly over time. It also is a good kind of, it almost is, I'm trying to think of a good way to put it. It fluffs up the soil to a certain extent. It makes it kind of resilient to things like compaction, where the soil gets very hard and tight and roots can't grow into. Extra organic matter can help with that. It can allow for water to drain more effectively too, because we're spacing out aggregates of soil so that water can go right through them. Kind of one of the other things that composting is good for is reducing methane releases. So when we do composting, especially when we do active composting, where we're bringing in air and oxygen to the system, that really reduces the amount of methane that would ordinarily be released if it was thrown into a landfill. So again, we're just a little bit of things in the margins we can do. You know, we're not going to win the battle overnight with food waste or climate change, but again, it's something that we can take agency and do in our own yards. And there's composting right there. So another benefit that people talk a lot about with composting is weed and disease control. So weed seeds can be destroyed with composting. Diseases can be destroyed by composting, but there's some really important caveats I want you guys to know. So composting microbes, there's lots of different classes. There's some that really like it kind of cooler, and then there's ones that really like it hot. Their kind of temperature range can, they might start moving around at 50 degrees or so. And then once it gets up to 150, that's getting to kind of their limits for some of them anyway. But, we see weed seeds actually die when you get to that 140 degree temperature range in the compost pile. And then when things get even hotter, then that's when diseases and nematodes can start to get roasted. So when you see people talk about how composting can remove diseases and weed seeds, that's what they're kind of talking about. But the important thing to note is that a lot of times your home compost piles may not stay at these temperatures for long enough. They may not get that high. So if you're using compost to eliminate weeds and plant diseases, have a backup strategy. I would really urge people not to kind of rest on their laurels when we talk about, I've got lots of weeds in this material I'm putting in. I just want to get rid of them. Just have a backup strategy, and extension can be very helpful for some of those tactics if you're having issues. So now we kind of dived a little bit into some of the benefits of composting and maybe why we should. Now we're going to get to the nitty gritty, okay, for what you guys all came here for. So I want to preface this before I go any further that composting is just about as much of an art as it is a science. A lot of it depends on exactly what you compost. So, it's going to be different from each and every person on this call. What you have available in your garden or your yard, or what scraps that you have at your home. A lot of times you're going to see composting materials that get very specific, and tells you what weights to use and etc. You don't really know exactly 100% how much of what is in the materials you're putting in. We just have educated guesses. There are some tips and tricks also that people like to say, well, I do this to my compost and it makes it go really well, or I don't like doing this because of X, Y, Z. Some of those things are more fact-based than others. And we'll dive a little bit briefly into those, kind of some of those more popular things that I see kind of floated around. So the big thing I want you to take is that you treat these as guidelines. Whatever I say is going to be guidelines. It's not going to be a law. And there's even big differences between extension services. So again, before the talk began, I was talking with Kelly about some of the extension services that have guidelines or their own kind of recipes and things. It's quite different even between several different states. So I'll try to highlight some of those big differences that I saw. And I think there were two major ones that I observed when I was doing research about this talk. And I put Leonardo da Vinci on there because I always think of him as kind of the art scientist type. So composting is not going to be a Mona Lisa, but it'll be something hopefully. So kind of, if you saw the description of the talk or any of the kind of the communications, we want to make composting bacteria happy. We want them to live an easy, a very nice life, and they really need just a few basic things, right? They're going to need water. They're going to need carbon, and I kind of represented carbon with breads, carbohydrates, right? A lot of carbon in them. Think of it like sugar, kind of the food for a lot of these microbes. And then nitrogen. When I think of nitrogen, I think of protein. I think of fish. I think of nuts. I think of those types of things. And bacteria need them too to build their bodies. So, and then of course, air. So the type of composting bacteria, the thing that makes compost and not a smelly pile, is that we're bringing in air to the system. And the types of bacteria that do really good work in a compost pile need that oxygen, that need that air, along with the protein, along with the sugar, and along with the water. And then obviously temperature is important too. So there might be little residual activity in the winter months, but obviously some help from Mother Nature can assist with some of these processes, kind of get these microbes up and going. So we don't have an infinite amount of time today, but I will tell you that there are lots and lots and lots of compost bin designs that you can find online. Some of them are quite detailed in how they're constructed. There are lots that you can buy pre-made. So I would refer to some of our extension materials about that. So North Carolina Extension and University of Minnesota Extension have some more resources about these types of bin structures. I'm sure if the people that are from other states A lot of times they can be useful to Cornell University, et cetera. But when you're designing your bin and you're looking about where to place your compost bin, you want to kind of make it easier on yourself. You're going to eventually need to add water to your compost pile. So it has to be somewhere where you can get a hose or when you can get out there easily. And if it's closer to the types of material that you're going to be using for compost, that's also going to be key. A lot of times if we have something that's far away or a lot of work, it makes it a lot harder to get up and kind of do these things to make a compost pile an active compost pile and not something more akin to a cold composting. But one of the big things when you're looking at bin designs as well as placement is kind of the dimensions. If you don't have the right size, and often if they're too small, if the bin is too small, this composting thing won't work very effectively. You won't get to those very high temperatures. So usually you're going to see with extension services about 3 to 5 feet in all dimensions, so length, width, and height. Usually the minimum that I've seen is the 3 by 3 by 3, but again, people will run into issues if you have something smaller than that. And another kind of issue I see people doing when they have bin designs and bin placements is they kind of put things as they go very slowly. A good idea is to get a decent amount of material kind of stockpiled and then put it into the compost pile. So that way we can get these composting processes ready and we kind of hit that critical mass right away. So that 3 by 3 by 3. So basically what I'm saying is don't have an infinite sized pile if you're going for a more active compost. So what that means is, don't just keep throwing things in a pile and have it get really big. That's not necessarily active composting. That's probably more akin to cold composting methods. And one of the ways around that is you see this kind of 3-tiered compost bin. What that means is you might get it started in one bin, and then when you get new material, you can start another one while you're mixing that previous bin. So it kind of makes it so that you can kind of get 3 loads of your lawn or kitchen scraps in. So you kind of avoid that infinite compost heap, but you still have multiple times to get out there and work and get material out. So I kind of mentioned this a few times already about hot versus cold composting. And when I talk about hot versus cold composting, a lot of times it's in relation to time and effort in terms of labor. So a lot of people, I would recommend they do cold composting. I do cold composting a lot where I have a garden. And we saw that a little bit with the Farmers of 40 Centuries book, where the farmers from China and Japan would do this. A lot of times they would dig trenches, pits, they could layer things in sheets. And then in that case, you're basically putting all the right ingredients together and then just letting nature take its course more or less. So you're more tweaking the decomposition instead of controlling it. So there's a lot of fun, interesting ways that people have done cold composting where they might do it in between raised beds. They might make a trench and then fill the material up with layers of compost material, then cap it off with a soil layer, and then allow the microbes in the soil and the weather to work those materials down. The one problem is that this tends to take quite a long time in comparison to active composting. Usually it's a year or so. And I mentioned pits and trenches and sheets, but that kind of also includes that infinite size pile that I kind of warned you guys about. If you can just pile things up, and as long as they're a certain, chopped up to maybe a few, some of the bulky things are chopped up a bit, that would count as a cold compost pile where you're just hauling things out in a corner and just letting nature take its course more or less. On the other hand, and what most people think of when they think of composting is the hot or the active composting. So that requires turning the material, that requires watering it occasionally. You're going to be using bins, you're going to be using cages, you're going to be using some of those structures I showed earlier. That's where it's going to be more involved composting, where you're going to be doing a little bit more labor. So we're going to get to what you put into the compost pile. And again, I'm coming at this, I'm a soil scientist and an agriculture person, so I think of carbon and nitrogen. A lot of times that kind of gets broken down with composting into something called browns and greens. And when we look at what makes a good compost, there you might see things that talk about C to N ratio. So C to N ratio is for every molecule of carbon or atom of carbon, you'll have an atom of nitrogen, and that's just the structure of the plant. So when you have less than 30-to-1 C to N ratio, so you have something that's more nitrogen based, has more nitrogen molecules and atoms in there, that would be considered a green. Now you'll see a range. If you go on extension websites, you'll see a range that 25-to-1 to 30-to-1, that's kind of the magic number. And both of those are valid. I just picked 30-to-1 for this slide, just to kind of lump things in. So a green material would be something that's less than 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Browns would be something that would be the opposite, would be more than that. And we mentioned earlier about coffee grounds. Now, what is coffee grounds? Are they a green or a brown? They are a green, something around 20-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So they would be considered green. So one of the problems when you say things are brown or green in terms of compost is it doesn't necessarily match with the color of the material you're putting into. It's a little bit more accurate to talk about carbon to nitrogen ratios. But one of the other major sources of disagreement from a lot of guides out there, composting guides, is the exact ratio of compostable material that they want you to add to your pile. 3-to-1, I believe, a brown to green. Now I'm saying brown to green. I'm not saying carbon to nitrogen. 3-to-1 brown to green ratio. And these are usually done by volume. So you might hear this as 3 buckets of brown to 1 bucket of green, that type of thinking and vocab and some of the guides. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about a volume. They're talking about these ratios. I've seen 2-to-1 also in a lot of extension materials, and I've seen things even as low as 1-to-1. So which one do you use? These seem pretty big differences. And this is where we get to the art more than the science. In a perfect world, we want to have the whole compost pile as an average start off around that 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. The reason why is that if you get your compost pile to start off at that ratio of carbon to nitrogen, usually you can get a pretty good fast compost going. You don't lose as much nitrogen wasted in that situation, and it tends not to be as smelly. If you had a really low carbon to nitrogen ratio or really green heavy initial pile, some of those things, it might get smelly. You might lose some of that nitrogen to certain microbes, might cause it to be lost and not used. The reason why it's so hard to kind of get to that initial goal is that a C to N ratio doesn't match up to the browns to greens 1-to-1, right? We can look at a book value. We can look at a sheet of paper that tells me that this is 20-to-1, but how much water is it? Do weights come into play? Spoiler alert, they do in real life. But a lot of times people are not going to have scales. They're not going to have a laboratory in their house to measure these things. A lot of times, a leaf from one tree species could be very different from a leaf from another. That can throw a wrench into things. So a lot of times there's a lot of ambiguity with this. We have guidelines, we have things that are generally true, but a lot can happen in the margins, especially with composting. So I would urge people to try one of these ratios. The 3-to-1 brown, the 2-to-1 brown to green, or the 1-to-1 green to brown, and just see if you're getting a compost working. Are you getting temperature increases in the middle of the pile? Is it too smelly? Is nothing happening? So you'll take these cues and you'll adjust as you go, because again, everybody's material is going to be so different from what they're putting into their pile, that I can't just by and large say, do this, do this, do this, and it would work for everybody in this room. So the next kind of part, we're going to kind of go into some examples of what are considered green sources. So green sources, just as a reminder, are going to have C to N ratios of less than 30-to-1. That would include grass clippings. That's usually the most common one that people might add to a compost bin as a green source, along with coffee grounds. Again, coffee grounds don't look very green, but kind of the way that helps me think of coffee grounds being a green source, you think that it's the seed from a coffee plant. So the fruit of the coffee plant is being used as what we drink, and the dredges of that are what we put in the compost pile. So that kind of makes me think, okay, so the plant is putting a lot of resources into that seed. That may be why it's a C to N ratio of less than 30-to-1. And then a lot of your veggies and fruit scraps will fall into this method, or this green ratio. Other things like flower arrangements tend to be that too. Anything that's kind of succulent, green, used to, quite not far off removed from the plant itself, or the fruit of the plant, tends to go into the green source. Residues from your garden, especially if they're from a legume, if they're a pea, or if they are a bean, or other things like that, that would fall under this less than 30-to-1 ratio. And that's just a small sampling. So North Carolina Extension has a big list of materials that they classify as green and brown. And a lot of times there's a lot of questions about what's acceptable and what's not. I would urge you to kind of look at some of those resources. Again, we don't have time to go through every feedstock. I just wanted to kind of get some of the major ones. And now we're going to the brown resources. So these are the ones that have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of greater than 30-to-1. These would include things like needles from pine trees, and you want to go a little bit easy on that, but it would count as a brown source, along with leaves, tree leaves, twigs, some woody material. Again, we want to make sure that it's kind of in that 2-inch range. We don't want to put huge branches and jam them into the compost pile. Again, the microbes like some surface area. So the smaller things are, the more easy it is for them. Again, we want to make microbes happy. So don't be shy about adding a few twigs in your compost pile. Just kind of break them up a little bit when you put them in there. Things like paper towels also can work. Egg cartons, cereal boxes, and straw. These are all types of material that you find a lot of, or have a lot of access to, and they would fit as a C to N ratio. There's other things like sawdust, where that also is a very heavy carbon source, doesn't have nitrogen, barely any at all. We're looking at 300-to-1 and above. So you want to go a little easy on that. Again, the whole goal is to start the whole pile as an average. We want to keep it around that 30-to-1. If we put a lot of sawdust, that's going to really hold us back in reaching that goal. So I'm learning German, so I wanted to put some more German in here. So I said verboten, so that means forbidden materials. And it's important to note that a lot of these things to put into a compost pile, in real life, yes, they can compost. They can compost quite well. That would include meat, and a lot of other things. A lot of farmers have to have compost piles for animals that pass away on the farm. Composting works for those. But one of the reasons we want to try to avoid some of those materials is because of critters and animals that might come into your property and cause issues. So that meat, dairy, eggs, oil, the oil is kind of more on the, it takes a long time to decompose, and it also might stink a little bit. But, we want to kind of avoid that. Now, if you want to wash your egg shells and put them in the compost, that's fine. Just letting people know that if you add lots of those materials in there, expect some visits from critters. One of the other things I see happen a lot with grass clippings is if a lawn care service is spraying certain types of herbicides that have a long residual time to them, which means that the active ingredient in that herbicide works for a long time, even after you cut it and put it in the compost pile. I would be cautious about that. We'll mention it later on, but it is possible that the herbicides might survive the home composting process. And if you add it back to your vegetable garden, it could injure young plants. So fresh manure, again, and especially not pet manure. That is a no matter where you're at, for a lot of different reasons. But if you're adding things like cow manure, horse manure, etc., I would be cautious. Again, we mentioned the disease issues with compost piles. A lot of times they don't get that hot to eliminate some of those concerns to make it really truly composted manure. I would treat, if you put manure into a compost pile, kind of treat it like it was fresh, because again, it's really hard to trust that you hit all those boxes when you went and did it to your home compost pile. With pets, it's definitely a no-no for a lot of different reasons. Animals might be given medicines, and that can get through the manure, and other things. And carnivores like cats and dogs, their manure is not very good for this type of process either. And it's obviously safety concerns for yourself, etc. Just say no to the pet manure and be really cautious about other types of farm animal manure.
Shane,
Yeah.
I have a question in the chat that kind of goes with verboten materials. And the question was asked if someone had like a cereal box that they were going to compost, would you be concerned about the dyes, etc., that are in the inks?
Right.
And just a heads up to everyone, I was just reminded also that at 1:45, there's a statewide tornado drill. So if you hear an alarm or sirens, that'll be what's going on. And I don't know whether we'll hear it on Shane's computer or not.
Yeah. And for the out-of-state people, it's really aggravating for us Minnesotans, because we just had our monthly tornado siren drill on Wednesday. So we're getting another one today. So that's just fun. And it's snowing outside. So anyway, but yes, going back to the question about the cereal boxes and the dyes, that is an excellent question. And I don't have an easy answer for you. It really depends on what types of dyes they're making or what material is on there. So I can't give a super educated response. In that case, if you're worried about those things, I would cut off. I would just not deal with it, not try to experiment with it. If you're concerned about those dyes, I would look for other brown resources, paper towels, wood chips, straw, leaves. Aim for more of those. The egg cartons are pretty universally okay to use, but yes, I agree. There's some people are concerned about the dyes and certain treatments on the boxes. In that case, I would just say put that out and look at other materials if that is a concern. And then kind of going along those more verboten materials, allelopathic plants. So when I say allelopathic, that's I'm not trying to exercise my tongue and try to make some new sounds. That is a term that certain plants put chemicals out to harm other plants. It's an evolution strategy. Black walnut is pretty common where we're at in Minnesota, and a lot of landscapes, and a lot of gardeners that have black walnuts in their yard kind of know about this. But just in case, that there are certain chemicals in the leaves, in the wood, etc., that could maybe survive that composting process and injure or stop the growth of certain garden plants. So black walnut would be one. That's probably the most common one. There are some other ones out there too, but in most, and there's people from out of state as well, but in Minnesota, it's almost always the black walnut. There could be other things like garlic mustard, other types of weeds that might have some issues. Just stay away from the black walnut stuff. And then lastly, maybe a little bit like a cup or so of wood ash is okay. But if you're putting in lots and lots of wood ash, that leads you to a couple different problems. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but wood ash is very, very basic. It has a high pH. It has a lot of potassium in that material, and putting lots and lots and lots of that material really increase the danger level for the plants down the road, and maybe even the composting process. And for some of the people that maybe live in a certain situation and they have lots of meat and dairy and eggs, and they really want to figure out a way to break those down, but maybe compost piles aren't the best way. There are some other options, and this was very popular in England, but these are called anaerobic solar digesters, where they use heat from the sun. And remember when we talked about what makes composting different is that we're bringing in air to the system, so that we're using bacteria that breathe oxygen. These would be using bacteria that don't like oxygen or don't like a lot of air. Now, this is usually a smelly process, but these are designed to minimize smell into use, and it's secured in a way that it limits some animals so that they won't get into it. But there's some designs out there. I haven't used one of these, but there's some municipalities in the United States and then in England and Australia that has some use on this. But that might be an option if you really want to try to figure out a way to use the meat that you have, your scraps, and you don't want to maybe put it into a compost pile. That might be kind of an option, but I have not used these personally. So now we're going to move away from the verboten materials and the green and brown materials. Now we're going to talk about another really important aspect of composting is water, right? A lot of times that is a missing ingredient in a lot of the home compost piles that I might see. We want to try to get to that range of 40 to 60% moisture. So that's just a number. It's not going to mean anything, but a lot of times the qualitative way to figure that out is to, when you grab into or put your hand in the compost pile, it should feel like a wrung out sponge. You shouldn't be able to squeeze it and have water run all over. So if you find yourself into a dry situation where you don't feel anything really at all, a lot of times you can use a hose or water. And don't forget to count weather. We just had a drought last year in our area. I had a lot of problems with people that transplanted trees and wondered why they died. They didn't go out and water it. So keep in mind weather when you're doing your compost pile. And again, use some of these kind of rules of thumb to kind of see if you're hitting that right spot for the water. And probably the most important thing that that I also see not done a lot in home compost piles is that aeration, or turning the pile. And there the sirens go off, but it is the most labor intensive, and that kind of might steer people away from composting, is getting out there and turning this material. There's some barrel designs that can help, usually the drum ones where you can put it on the ground and roll it, or you have a hand crank. Those ones tend to be on the smaller side of things, so that's kind of the negative on that. But those are kind of designed with that kind of in mind to make it easier on the person. So the reason why we want to turn the pile in a compost heap is that oxygen gets depleted faster in the middle. So we're getting a warm area. The bacteria are living fast. They're having fun. They're breathing. So they're going to be running out of oxygen. So that's why we have to turn that pile to keep them happy. Now, here's another big difference between extension services about how often to turn the pile. The University of Minnesota Extension has it 2 to 3 times a month. Oklahoma State Extension has it 2 times a week. So there is a big, there's a little bit of a difference there in how often you turn it. So I would probably pick a number in between those two, or pick one or the other. But the biggest thing that to tell you on the right track is if you're doing it enough, you should be still having that warm center even after you're doing your turning. So again, there's a lot of experimentation. I wish I could tell you exactly how many times to do it, but those are just some guidelines that you might want to try at home when you're doing your aeration. And then there's tools that can also be very helpful for turning the pile. It almost looks like a corkscrew. Sometimes that can be easy to mix the pile up. Otherwise, a lot of people will use pitchforks to do so, or in the barrel case for the compost, they're just turning it, or they're putting it on the ground and they're rolling it down a bit.
So Shane,
Yeah.
just FYI, I know that some of our friends will need to leave at
Yep.
1:45.
Yep.
So I could have Rick put the evaluation in the chat. If you could just take a moment to fill out the evaluation,
Yep.
that would be wonderful. We'll do it. We'll add it again at the end, but that way people can give us some feedback. Also, I've had some questions about recording, and yes, we're recording.
Yep.
We'll send this out to you. So thank you.
Yep, and we're almost done. So we're gonna kind of we'll move through here to the troubleshooting in a little bit. But this was kind of what I was hinting at earlier when we talk about, hey, what about this secret ingredient? Grandpa Jim or Grandma Jill used this all the time and it worked really well. So here's kind of some of the lists of things that I see a lot of. Compost starters and using old compost from old piles or topsoil as a way to bring in more microbes to your pile. Certainly try to do that. There's no harm in that. I think a lot of times the right type of microbes that you want will come with the material you're putting into the pile, but it's something to experiment with and see if you have any success. Oh, and then we get to my old friend gypsum. I have seen so many. Gypsum can cure any problem in the garden, right? Not really. I see this a lot for everything, every problem, diseases. Gypsum has very certain specific uses. Putting them in a compost pile is not going to do anything really special. There are very limited cases about when to use gypsum in your garden. For fertility, or particularly if you have a really salty sodium on your soil. You can try it, but I'm really skeptical about gypsum in a lot of different ways about using it as a cure-all. Sometimes people, particularly if they're not getting the compost pile to work, if they're not getting that, they may not have put enough green material in there. Sometimes they'll put a little bit of fertilizer, so maybe some urea or some blood or blood meal to get it started. Again, everything in moderation. If we put too much of that fertilizer in, that can cause issues too. So be careful with that. Lime. Lime is another really common one that I hear a lot about. People say, well, the compost is acidic, etc. A lot of time when compost is finished, it might be slightly acidic, but it will balance out eventually if we kind of follow those guidelines. If we're really off, if we have a lot of pine needles or something really weird is going on, maybe lime could help. But one of the problems with adding lime to the compost pile is that any nitrogen that's in that pile can have a chemical reaction if the pH is really alkaline or has lots of lime in it. And we can lose that nitrogen. So we won't be able to get that little bit that we need for that we can get out of compost. So if you have your situation where you have acidity problems, kind of look at that as a separate thing. Apply the lime differently apart from the compost. And then we have lots of people that like worms, using red wigglers, other types of critters to do extra work in the compost pile. I would urge people to do something more specialized, something that will be a little bit more friendly to the worms. That might be able to help a little bit, but vermicomposting is probably what you're going to be looking at, and that's a whole other talk. I would urge people to kind of look at those types of systems rather than a typical backyard pile. So when is it done? It's going to have a nice earthy, sweet smell, or sweeter smell. At least I think it smells sweet, but a lot of people will say earthy. It will resemble soil or fine mulch. It's going to be really hard. If you did your compost pile right, you should not see, oh, there's the orange peel. Oh, crap. Or, oh, yeah, there's the banana peel. It should be very hard to identify the individual material you put into the compost. If it was done correctly, you should be able to just see general plant material. You can't even tell. Also, you're not going to get any more heat generated in the middle. And the length of time is extremely variable. 2 to 6 months is usually kind of the average, but it can be much more than that. I guess if we have more issues, or if you're doing everything absolutely perfectly, you probably could go below that 2 months. But usually 2 to 6 is what we usually see. And now we're going to get to the last part, is the troubleshooting issues. So my pile is smelly, it's too wet, it's got flies, what's going on? Well, most of the time that is because of no aeration. So you're not aerating the pile, and you've got too few brown or carbonaceous materials in there. Sometimes they can be too fine of a material. So, if things are chopped really fine, things are going really fast. Sometimes that can be an issue as well. And if it's water too heavy, especially when the too fine material and the water too heavy mixed together, that's when you can get some of these smells. And I put a soldier fly on here. So this is a soldier fly. They're actually kind of good composters of a lot of different things. So it's maybe not the flies that is the problem. It might be the other things, but most people don't want to deal with flies. So those are my little solutions for the compost pile. And here's a good picture. Nothing's happening at all. Nothing's going on in my pile. A lot of times that's obviously, you don't have enough of that nitrogen rich material. The pile isn't big enough. So remember when I talked about the 3 by 3 by 3 feet, if it's smaller than that, you can reach this kind of issue. Sometimes if the litter is too coarse, so think of those big branches, right? When we talked about chopping up at least to a couple inches. And then otherwise, they're not aerating it, they're not watering it. And here's one I like. The compost that I made killed my plants. What happened? One of those is those residual herbicides. And we talked about with the grass clippings, sometimes that can happen. Too much wood ash. So then we're dealing with a really high pH. We're dealing with salt type damage with the potassium. Same goes for nitrogen. If we put a really hot nitrogen fertilizer into our pile to try to speed it up, maybe if we put too much and put it onto the leaves, that can be an issue for plants. And then other salts. So depending on what materials we're putting into the pile, we might have quite a bit of salt that can cause issues to foliage. And I like this picture. Critters are causing issues. So I deal with raccoons a lot. Other people might deal with other critters. But again, that's when we're going to that meat, that eggs, that dairy, oil drippings. Sometimes if you're using blood meal or bone meal, or you're putting some of those types of organic fertilizers in your compost pile, that might bring some of these critters down. And then we get to the too much green material is added, or the pile itself is not well secured or secluded. And if you have lots of problems with these types of animals, then maybe some of those drum type setups might be helpful. So yeah, raccoons is ones that I've seen cause issues, but some people mention rodents. So those are kind of some possible solutions. So at the end of my talk, so the key takeaways is that composting can combat food and energy waste to a certain extent. Air, water, carbon, nitrogen are key. You know, they want that sugar, they want that protein, and they want air and they want water. It's not an exact science. There's a lot of wiggle room. I urge you guys to experiment within reason, avoid those verboten materials. And, you know, that's essentially what I wanted you guys to get away with. We have some resources available. Our website has some good information. North Carolina Extension has good materials for composting. That's my talk, and I am pleased to have any questions.
Well, we do have some questions in the chat.
Sure.
Questions about horse manure, aged
Yes.
manure. Is that something that can go into the compost pile?
Right. So aged manure is not composted manure. It's a little bit of a difference. But yeah, again, if you were to add manure to your compost pile, there are some guidelines about what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is for those manures. I think horse is 25-1. I could be wrong. Again, if you do put manure into your compost pile, I would treat it as fresh manure in terms of food safety. So what does that mean? So the organic farmers that I work with, when they use manure as a fresh material, they're not allowed to apply it. I think they have 120 days before harvest where they can put that raw manure on, and then 90 days if it's a plant that doesn't have parts that could be hit by soil particles. So that would be like corn and tree fruit. That would be the 90 days. Things like tomatoes and lettuce and those types of things would be that 120 days. But we're in Minnesota. We don't usually have really huge, long growing seasons. So yeah, I really worry about compost. If you're an expert in composting, yes, go ahead. You can put manure in there. But you know, for most of the backyard gardeners, I really urge caution.
Thank you. Somebody wants to know, are hickory trees allelopathic?
Allelopathic? I don't believe
Yes.
so. I'd have to check, but I don't believe off the top of my head. I'll have to get back to you on that. Black walnut is the one that is, and there are other weeds that can also be an issue. But
what about newspaper, the non-glossy type?
Yep, I believe that is a compostable material, the non-glossy kind of standardized type of newspaper. Yeah, and a lot of times I use that in my passive. So I have passive compost. A lot of times I like to use newspaper like that.
And how can you tell if it's too dry and needs water? How often do you stir it?
Right. So too dry would be, it can't keep a form. So if you were to grab it and squeeze it, now remember, too much would be water running down. But too dry, it would go right through your fingers. It can't even hold a shape. Or you don't feel moisture at all. Again, there's going to be numbers out there, but using your hands, using your senses, those little tricks, a lot of times if it's falling through, you don't feel anything, especially if the pile is not warm at all. That can really tell you that, you know, there might be a piece missing, and that might be that water.
Okay, one more question before we on your professional opinion, what do you think of those 24-hour composting appliances that you can put on your countertop? Oh,
well, and I don't know if that falls into that anaerobic. I wonder if that falls into the anaerobic digester side of things. A lot of times when I think of those tabletop compost things, they're more of a storage vessel for you to accumulate yard scraps and then take them out to the pile. But I guess I'm not super familiar with the 24/7 compost countertop stuff. I wonder if it fits into that anaerobic type system where it limits the smell, but uses those types of bacteria to break it down. It's interesting. I'll have to look that up.
Well, Shane, thank you so much for all of this great information. Perfect timing as we're getting ready for spring and setting things up in our yards. So we greatly appreciate it. And take a moment to fill out the evaluation give us any feedback. We do have some additional family-friendly earth care webinars coming up in the future, so please sign up. Thank you, everyone.